Greetings, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or whatever time period you will be listening to this presentation of Chapter 11 in The Grand Design Exposed by John Daniel. And Chapter 11 is called Architects of the Grand Design. And the previous chapter was quite the revealing, had quite a lot of revealing information in it. And Chapter 11 picks up right where Chapter 10 left off. And so we are going to basically look at the architecture of the Grand Design. And I'm not talking about physical buildings, but the building of a mindset, how things came about. And this is really what a lot of this chapter is going to be about. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first section is called Looking for a Suspect. Of all the creatures that God placed upon the earth, only mankind was given the ability to think, to plan. And for the most of us, the plans we make will only affect ourselves and our children within our own lifespans. However, certain passions, like longing to fly or harnessing nature's elements, have driven men's minds to thinking and planning for many generations. But for even a longer period of time, there have been those few men with not so benevolent plans, sinister minds, with an unsatiated lust for power and war, a passion to conquer and rule over others. Man's dream of flying has been fulfilled, as has so many other of his technological goals we enjoy today. So if by thinking man has the ability to bring what once seemed to be impossible dreams for good to reality, why not the same for evil? Why should it be considered too ridiculous or absurd to believe that men of this mindset would think out and formulate a master plan that would enable them one day to rule the world? It seems, on the contrary, when taken into consideration the carnal nature of man, that to not believe man would devise such a plan would be even more ridiculous. The preceding chapters have endeavored to show that there is undeniably a conspiracy plot by an elite few who want to control the world. But it is an occultic agenda, or a hidden agenda. By subtly utilizing and propagating occult practices and influences, popularized by its sun worship rituals, architectural symbolism, calendar dates, fertility rites, and magicians, occultism becomes the driving force propelling this global scheme to its final climax. And regardless of other conspiracy writers who so ardently want to blame the Protestants, the capitalist West, and even the Jews for all the miseries in the world, although some have been cleverly placed in prominent positions as decoys, these same writers, with vehemence, are reluctant to even remotely consider a much more suitable global and occultic suspect. So it seemed very reasonable and logical to examine an already self-proclaimed geo-religious and geopolitical organization, renowned in that it boldly and haughtily declares its global agenda and ambitions, and in its very name, the Roman Universal or Catholic Church. What better evidence is needed for a place to look when the word Catholicism literally means and is synonymous with universalism and globalism? That's one thing we really have to consider. Is all you have to do is look at the word Catholicism. There is no conspiracy about that. There's nothing conspiratorial about that. The word Catholicism means universalism or globalism. That's what it means. Okay? I mean, take the notion of the aspect of the word church out of the equation. And when you boil it down to brass tacks, the word Catholicism means exactly universalism and globalism. And I want to emphasize too, because a lot of people are on this Jew bandwagon, that the Jews rule the world. It's run by Zionists and Rothschilds and these types of things. And I like the little emphasis he put on here when he said, even the Jews for all the miseries in the world. Although some have been cleverly placed in prominent positions as decoys. Okay? Cleverly placed. As a matter of fact, you can look at the Supreme Court. You want to talk about cleverly placed. The majority of the judges in the Supreme Court are all Roman Catholics. But they had to throw in a couple Jews in there. Just two. Another one regarding, Jews running Hollywood and these types of things. And everyone likes to quote that article from the LA Times where I forgot who it was giving an interview, and he basically said in a nutshell that in the article, in LA Times article, that, well, don't you know that the Jews run Hollywood? Now I want you to think about that for a second. Here is a mainstream news publication. Alright? Here's a mainstream news publication. And if the Jews were doing things so secretly, why would they come out in the open and just brag about it? It wouldn't be much of a secret now, wouldn't it? That's why I like what he stated here. Although some have been cleverly placed in prominent positions as decoys, to get your mind focused away from the real problem. That's why Jews are used the way they are. That's why they're put in these positions. Anyways, back to the book. As with any pyramidal scheme, whether it is in marketing, Freemasonry, the Jesuits, or the Roman Catholic Church, it is a hierarchy. Those at the top level of the pyramid leech off the efforts and revenues of the hundreds of thousands of those under them at the lower levels. Nor is it intended for those while at the bottom to ever know the purposes and affairs of those at the top. The lower levels are intentionally lied to and deceived, so as to make them to think that they know. Many Freemasons, when enlightened on certain points related to Freemasonry, will honestly exclaim, "I have never heard, or was I ever taught such a thing in the lodge?" You can believe they are telling the truth. It is the same innocent reaction when, out of love, viewpoints related to Catholicism are shared with a friend or relative who has been educated in the Roman Catholic school system. They just do not know. Nothing is more heartrending than to hear it humbly and sincerely said. Everything I know about Christianity I have learned from the Catholic schools and my church. They are speaking from the heart. At the bottom of the pyramid, they are taught Christ. At the top, it's an occultic different matter. As impossible as it seems for most people to believe that Catholicism is involved in the promotion of globalism, it is even more harder for them to believe that Rome is the world's center for occultism. However, Christianity for the Roman Church is just a mask, hiding her true identity and nature of the occult. This is also her most sacred double face, of which she has many, purposely given a false and disbelieving appearance to be opposing her own self. And that's true. That's true. A perfect example of this is look how they mistreated the Knights Templar, who are a very occultic organization. And so here, putting up a Christian front would expose them And, even through the Inquisitions, witches and pagans and these types of things, they would expose them as these evil occult systems, when in fact that they are the root of occultism in the world today. At first thought, this may seem like a very harsh accusation, but in reality, Rome has honed and perfected quite a unique system, using it repeatedly and very successfully. This working principle and process must be clearly understood if anyone is to ever understand the diverting techniques Rome uses to achieve her goals. Intentionally, two apparent contradictories, thesis and antithesis, square off at each other, but later are reconciled as synthesis. For example, Christianity being the thesis and occultism being antithesis. They, as opposing forces, are brought together. What comes out of this mixing is a blend of the two, or a synthesis. We find the most excellent workings of this today, right before our eyes, in the ecumenical movement, as it strives to join all pagan religions together with Christianity. In philosophical jargon, it is called dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism. Germany targeted for Catholic Freemasonry's Enlightenment. Now, with these thoughts in mind, we will now move into the events that shape the next phase of the grand design. Pay particular attention to the dates surrounding these events so as to provide a more comprehensive picture. The dates are important, folks, so really, when I list off the dates, just engrave them in your mind, or take notes, or pause me if you have to pause me, or re-listen to this if you have to. When Rome launched her counter-offensive to halt the progress of Protestantism, she began in Germany, one of the areas where she felt the sedition was most deeply rooted. When Rome had finished, Germany was depopulated. Its people had either been killed by the 30 Years' War, or for those fortunate enough, had fled the area. Germany itself had been reduced to a virtual wilderness area. For the next 100 years, Germany staggered as it began its healing process. The terms of the Westphalia Peace Treaty allowed subjects under that northern German Protestant princes to practice unmolested their Protestant religion, which enabled many pockets of Protestant resistance to still remain. To neutralize this situation and the effectiveness of Protestantism in northern Germany and Prussia, Catholic modified Freemasonry began its work. To the disappointment and anger of Rome, the 30 Years' War was brought to an end in the year 1648. James II of England was ousted from his throne in 1688, who then fled to France, taking with him his brand of Catholic Jacobite Freemasonry. Jacobites determined to recapture the English throne knew it only could be accomplished by force, for in 1689, James and his son had specifically been denied the succession by an act of Parliament that stated unconditionally that no Roman Catholic or spouse of a Roman Catholic could occupy the British throne. It's a very important statement. England was now ruled by Protestant thought and Parliament. When in 1715 the Third Jacobite Revolt was put down, that victory underscored to the world that England was not only Protestant, but also a fortress to aptly defend what was Protestant. In 1717, English Protestant Freemasonry, now secure in Protestant England and without fear of being threatened, revealed itself publicly to the world. And again, I have to emphasize that this is more of the thing is with Protestantism is it's got its secular portion to it. Granted, even the secular portion has biblical principles to it. Okay? And so when they say Protestant England, it doesn't necessarily mean that those in royalty were all on fire for God and these types of things. I'm sure some of them were. But you have to understand that Protestant to protest came on two fronts. Again, I have to remind you of this. You had the secular and you had the religious. You had those that protested Rome from a merely secular and political standpoint, and you had those that not only protested Rome from a political standpoint, but also a religious standpoint, in the aspect of the Word of God being the head, and Jesus Christ being the head of the church, not the Pope. Okay, so I know it kind of sounds like a broken record when I say that, but I really want to get that engraved. Anyways, moving on. However, it was precisely at this time when English Protestant Freemasonry was feeling the most secure and confident in its accomplishments. They feel like they had won the war. They basically felt relaxed. They were secure. That, on the other hand, the Jesuits were working the hardest to infiltrate it. English Freemasonry, posing as it did to be pure Protestant, became then the most practical and deceptive tool of the Jesuits for introducing into Germany, especially northern Protestant Germany. It is also precisely at this time, in the year 1716, that we have the account of the first German lodge being erected in the city of Cologne, and before the year 1725 there were many others, both in Protestant and Catholic Germany. Those of Wetzlar, Frankfurt, Brunswick, and Hamburg are the oldest. Take notice that they received their institution from a mother lodge in England, not France. Even though, and very interestingly, all seem to have got the mystery through the same channel. The banished friends of the Stuart family. These were Catholics, who entered into the service of Catholic Austria and the Catholic German princes. By the time year 1745 had rolled around, the year of the disastrous and final revolt to re-establish the Catholic Stuarts on the English throne, which decided forever that the cherished Jacobite dream was a lost cause, Germany had become infested with Catholic modified Freemasonry. By then also, Germany was intensely collaborating with its neighbors' French Freemasonry. To the average person today, an English king being ran off his throne is an insignificant tale. However, back then, it not only infuriated the Catholic hierarchy, but its effects even stretched and vibrated across the Atlantic, stirring up many of America's settlers to where more than 9,000 Scotch Highlanders stormed into the Carolinas to protest the rout of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The issue at the time was highly inflammable and emotional. When King James II fled England going to France, France then became the center and command post for all the Catholic outrage that was felt for Protestant England. Later on, when Bonnie Charles' revolt proved futile, the Jacobite cause within Freemasonry was dropped, but emphatically never with the idea of giving up on making England Catholic. Shifting gears into a much broader and shrewder plan that would bring the whole world under a cosmopolitan citizenship, Germany then was joined with France to become a hubbub of activity for enlightened, modified Freemasonry. Now, what was to come about with this enlightened, modified Freemasonry? This was basically the birth of the Enlightenment era. Like your George Washingtons and Benjamin Franklins and Thomas Paines and these types of things, which we will get into later on in this book. We're actually getting fairly close to some very unique American history that has not been told to you and has basically been left out. It's time to shine a light in these dark places. Prussia's Frederick the Great given key role. Notice now how all of this comes together. Prussia was a state in northern Protestant Germany, who at the time was becoming a recognized military power in Europe. In 1740, the man to be later acclaimed as Frederick the Great came to the Prussian throne to succeed his father. He was regarded as a Protestant prince, so fitted very conveniently in the scheme of things. Remember the famous oration by the Frenchman Andrew Michael Ramsay? That was in 1737. The next year, 1738, Frederick is hastily initiated into Freemasonry at the age of 26, while passing through Brunswick. Prior to that, for 2 years, he had been carrying on a correspondence with Voltaire, one of the movers and shakers of the French Enlightenment. As we follow Frederick's Masonic career, in June of 1740, after his accession to the throne, we find him presiding over a lodge at Charlottenburg, where he received into the order 2 of his brothers, his brother-in-law and Duke Frederick William of Holstenbeck. At his request, the Baron de Bielefeld and his privy councillor Jordan founded a lodge at Berlin, the Three Globes, which by 1746 had no less than 14 lodges under its jurisdiction. In the same year of 1740, Voltaire, in response to urgent invitations, paid his first visit to Frederick in Germany. These visits became reciprocal between the two nations, for in 1741, Baron von Marschall and then in 1743, Baron von Hunt were sent to France as representatives of German Freemasonry. In 1750, Voltaire went back to Germany to spend 3 more years with Frederick. Now watch closely. In 1751, von Hunt founded the Order of Strict Observance. It was so called from the oath it demanded, an oath of unswerving and unquestioning obedience to the mysterious, quote-unquote, unknown superiors. Now, question. You need to ask yourself this question. Which military order requires unquestioning and unswerving obedience? I will leave you to answer that question. Moving on. Its basic teaching was that it had descended directly from the Knights Templar. This was not something new in the Freemasonic circle, for the French prior to this had developed and taught the same concept under the so-called Scottish Rite, later called Scottish Rite of Perfection. With its 25 degrees, Baron von Hunt's order of strict observance merely built upon this by adding another 7 degrees, making a total of 32. Later on, when this Scottish Rite migrated to North America and settled in both Boston, Massachusetts, and Charleston, South Carolina, one final degree was added to total 33, and then its name was upgraded, where it is known the world over today as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rites. When backtracking to the origin of this whole complexity of deception, it brings us straight to the real heart of the matter. The intense hatred of the Roman Catholic Church for anyone or anything that opposes her goals, namely Protestantism. It positively is not a Jewish conspiracy, but strictly Roman Catholic, who have strategically used certain Jews for their cause's advantage. We can trace this hatred starting with the utter destruction of the Spanish Armada, to all the plots and intrigues in between that cost the kings of England Charles I his head and James II his throne. Watch it follow James II into France to incite the Jacobite rebellions in England. See the Jacobite cause, through Andrew Michael Ramsay, develop Freemasonry into the Templar Scottish Rites. See it move into Germany to be built upon and become the ancient and accepted Scottish Rites. Then, being carried into the New World, to Boston, Massachusetts, where in 1756 the St. Andrew Lodge was founded that incited the American Revolution against England. To Charleston, South Carolina, where the notorious Luciferian Albert Pike, on January 6, 1859, became the sovereign Grand Commander of the Supreme Council of Charleston until his death in 1891, who during those years created the Satanic Supreme Rite named the New and Reformed Paladin Rite, who just happened to be residing as sovereign Grand Commander during the worst war this nation has ever before or since seen, the American Civil War. Let's elaborate just a bit more by quoting from several Freemasonic authorities. First, The Arcane School by John Yarker in page 480. Quote, in 1761, the lodges and councils of the superior degrees being extended throughout Europe, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, as Grand Commander of the Order of Princes of the Royal Secret, or 32 degrees, was by general consent acknowledged and recognized as sovereign and supreme head of the Scotch Rite. Unquote. The above statement with regard to the introduction of this rite in America is made in a report by Albert Pike. Here's another quotation. History of Freemasonry and Concordat Orders by H. L. Stilson and W. J. Hugan, page 243. Quote, on the 25th of October, 1762, the Grand Masonic Constitutions were finally ratified in Berlin and proclaimed for the government of all Masonic bodies working in the Scotch Rite over the two hemispheres. And in the same year, they were transmitted to Stephen Moran, who had been appointed at the request of Lecorne in August of 1761. Inspector General for the New World by the Grand Consistory of Princes of the Royal Secret, convened at Paris, under the presidency of Chillon de Joinville, representative of Frederick the Great, and substitute general of the order. It will be remembered that the 33rd degree was not then created, and under Frederick the Great there was no rank higher than the 32nd degree, nor anybody superior to a consistory. Unquote. And then from Scottish Rite Masonry by Blanchard, 33, volume 2, page 484, quote, and though made within the memory of men now living, we read, in the same note by McCoy, it is not certainly known when or where this degree originated, that is to say, its origin is concealed. This is the most infamous Masonic act, next to burning their records of 59 years before the war, that is the American Civil War, to hide treason. But slavery then ruled the country, and this 33rd Charleston degree ruled the lodge, and the Southern Lodge rooms worked up the most unjustifiable and infamous war on record. The Southern people were dragooned into it. by leaders secretly sworn to obey Masonic leaders or have their throats cut, unquote. From Adriano Lemmi by Domenico Margiotta, 33rd degree Freemason, page 86, quote, in 1795, Isaac Long went to Europe, leaving Colonel John Mitchell the direction of the Mother Lodge of Charleston. When he returned to the United States 6 years later, he brought the plan of his great idea, which was the creation of a rite of 33 degrees, destined to become universal. Now, what's another word for universal? With Colonel John Mitchell, Dr. Frederick Delco, Abraham Alexander, Isaac Auld, and Emmanuel de la Mata, all sovereign princes of Jerusalem, he constituted this rite, taking 25 degrees of the system of heirdom, 6 Templar grades, in which were merged 4 degrees borrowed from the German Illuminism of Adam Weishaupt, and 2 grades called grades of administration, the last of which supplanted the function of deputy inspector, or sovereign prince of Jerusalem, and took the title of Sovereign Grand Inspector General, 33rd and last degree. This was his crowning achievement. Isaac Long gave the institution the name of Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rites, and the first constitutions were signed at Charleston on May the 31st, 1801. And Margiotta comments further from the same book on page 88. Quote, the Mother Lodge of Boston had ceased functioning for some years, but that of Charleston, reconstituted according to the new Scottish system in 33 degrees, became the root of the tree which was to spread its branches over the entire world. The superior lodge of the Grand Sovereign Inspectors General in each country was to be called the Supreme Council, and it is from the Supreme Council of Charleston that all the others were to emanate. It is thus that first Supreme Council of the globe. Unquote. It does not take any great amount of imagination going back to the year 1649 when the people and the parliamentary forces tried King Charles I of England for high treason and beheaded him, to picture the anger and rage felt by his widow, Queen Henrietta, and the royal family with their adherents exiled in France. An event so dramatic and sensational had to be the top of every Frenchman's conversation. Listen, if you will. They are off in the distance, and you will certainly hear the jungle lions growling, snarling, seeking a way for revenge. In the book Occult Theocracy by Lady Queensborough, pages 333 and 334, it says the royal family was, quote, warmly welcomed by the Jesuits of France, and, quote, the Jacobites, partisans of the Pretender, secretly plotting, as they constantly were, found the newly created Masonic lodges a ground no less well adapted to serve their ends than the Jesuits' colleges, whence all their schemes emanated. They were one and the same thing. Let me repeat that quote. In the book Occult Theocracy by Lady Queensborough, pages 334 and 333 and 334, it says the royal family was, quote, warmly welcomed by the Jesuits of France, unquote, and, quote, the Jacobites, partisans of the Pretender, secretly plotting, as they constantly were, found the newly created Masonic lodges a ground no less well adapted to serve their ends than the Jesuits' colleges, whence all their schemes emanated. Unquote. And it is this Scottish rite, it is this Freemasonry, that we see the likes of Franklin, George Washington, and all these other founding fathers who we hold so dear and who we base our Protestantism on. Or, well, yeah, that too. But where we base our patriotism from is these founding fathers. Folks, the documentary Hidden Faith of the Founding Fathers is a good documentary, but the thing is, they only scratch the surface, and they talk about the Enlightenment and these types of things. But the question is this, is what was the hidden faith? We can go through Freemasonry all we want. We can be stuck in that rabbit hole all we want. Or you can look at the quotes from these books that are given, or the sources that are given in this book, and do the research yourself, and you will be able to find out who was behind the creation of this Freemasonry that we see the likes of Washington and Franklin and all of these other founders. And so then there's the question: who was working behind the scenes to foment the American Revolution, which led to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which I might add has not one iota of a mention of Jesus Christ in said document. For those that really want to stick to the whole America is a Christian nation ideal. It has two horns like a lamb, sure, but it speaks as a dragon. That's all I have to say. Moving on. All Freemasonry disguised as Protestant. Here we go. Here's where we're going to figure out why all of these people were supposedly Protestant. We're going to get into it in this section. What can we say to the casual observer of Freemasonry, whose early history and purpose seemed like a hodgepodge of confusion, full of quarrels, schisms, and contradictions, except that is exactly what its hidden leaders want us to see. They want us to see this hodgepodge, quarrels, schisms, and contraceptions. They want us to see this confusion. They don't want us to realize how organized this is. Freemasonry is a cover and must work under cover, knowing that if their goals were exposed, it would be quite repulsive to any sane and civil mind. Anything that diverts attention from their true purposes and those behind those purposes, so much the better. England is synonymous with everything that is Protestant. So to portray Freemasonry as English and Protestant became an important part of the theater. Under this pretense, rival or irregular lodges sprung up with higher degrees for the purpose to merge and alter English Masonry. United and corrupted, charters were then sent out from England's mother lodge to establish lodges in other countries. That is why, the world over, before an initiate can enter into any higher degrees, he must first pass through the first 3 degrees of English craft masonry, posing to be Protestant. This deception prepared the way for all Freemasonry to declare itself to be anti-clerical, anti-Catholic, anti-monarchy, with liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. We hear it all. We hear this all over with all these lower English craft masonry, because it sounds very much like Protestantism. because they are these things. You hear about this brotherhood. I used to work with somebody who was a Freemasonry, who is a Freemason of these lower degrees, and I tried to explain to him, but he just couldn't comprehend it. He says, "No, we're a brotherhood. We believe in the Christian faith and these types of things, and it's amazing. Sometimes it's really hard to get through to some of these people, but with God, all things is possible." So again, Masonry, posing to be Protestant, this deception prepared the way for all Freemasonry to declare itself to be anti-clerical, anti-Catholic, anti-monarchy, with liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, with popes thundering their condemnations. Today, their most convenient tactic for diversion is just to say that Freemasonry is Jewish. That's all you hear today. After the Jacobite failure of 1745, you see an explosion of Masonic lodges as the recruiting crusade expanded. France and Germany literally became honeycombed with Masonic societies. In less than 45 years, which brings us to the time of the French Revolution, France is said to have counted over 2,000 lodges affiliated to the Grand Orient, with about 100 members more or less in each. In Paris alone, there were 629 lodges. To bring rivalry groups together and unite them under a centralized control and to produce a true sense of direction, the first of two great Masonic conventions was held at Les Gaules, France, in 1768. Out of this, the Grand Orient de la France was instituted in 1773, very unique year. And as the Mother Lodge of Lyons, it became the voice and chief repository of Freemasonry in France. German Freemasonry was also centralized in Berlin, with Frederick the Great as the sovereign Grand Commander and head of all continental Freemasonry, who at the same time colluded with Philippe Aquilite, Duke d'Orleans, Grand Master of the Grand Orient, the richest man in France, and ambitious to be king, as his lieutenant. Continental Freemasonry at this time was nearing a climax that had gradually been working for over several decades. What was drawing power that seemed to literally pull hundreds of thousands to congregate into these secret societies? For bait, offering something better to any oppressed people, imaginary or not, would certainly arouse some sort of response. The appeal now was not toward replacing the Stuarts on the English throne, but shifted instead for ushering in a utopian life, promising liberty and equality for all men through a universal. You gotta love that word universal, especially when you know what the word means. Through a universal brotherhood. There is a sharp contrast here between what true Protestantism sacrificed its lifeblood for in order to gain basic freedoms and human rights, and taking responsibility for those freedoms by showing respect toward your neighbor, as compared to the exotic and extreme liberties and freedoms offered by Freemasonry that had no regard for God or the rights of others. With such fermentation being agitated in the public mind, the dupes of the lower degrees, as with any pyramidal hierarchy, as previously mentioned, swelled the ranks, preached the diluted doctrines of liberation, and filled the financial coffers for the unseen hands, guiding them so that their own diabolical dream of world rulership could be fulfilled. This peak of agitation, the Great Masonic Convention of 1768, Frederick the Great declared the head of continental Freemasonry and the Grand Orient de la France being instituted in 1773, was all a plan, all capital letters for emphasis, PLAN, being orchestrated and brought into play precisely, remember, when the Jesuit order was supposedly being dissolved. Also, in 1773. Jesuits were the epitome of the oppressions of Rome, and in an enlightened quote-unquote society, their voice had to be silenced. Actually, nothing could have served the Jesuits' purpose greater, working in dark secret as those at the apex of power in Freemasonry did. As we are caught spellbound, watching the scenes of this marvelous drama, there appears on stage another scene that rivets our attention. To the Jesuit, the theater and pageantry was one of their great passions. But now, the whole world becomes their amphitheater, and they bring upon the stage one of their most infamous actors. Anyone who has studied the history of the French Revolution are well aware that it had been preceded by a long period of intense intellectual agitation in which the foundations of the existing society were seriously questioned. Ideas and doctrines advocating the abolition of all religion, the overthrow of monarchical governments, the creation of utopian world citizenship, and the abolition of private property were to be found in books, tracts, and pamphlets written and distributed by the hundreds of thousands, often at the risk of provoking the authorities. A network of reading societies were established with the intention to monopolize the writing, publication, reviewing, and distribution of all literature more effectively, to use the printed word to control and subvert the minds of the readers. Education overload. But the main haven for the expression of these revolutionary ideas on the continent were the Masonic lodges, which, departing from the simpler practice of English Freemasonry and sworn to secrecy, had become forums where diverse opinions on morals, religion, and politics could be and freely expressed. Does that sound familiar? French and German Freemasonry united to launch French Revolution. Through inner ties and collaboration, French and German Freemasonry was brought together under one head. That head, seemingly, was Frederick the Great, and given the name Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rites. But Frederick the Great, being head of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rites Masonry, was just for show. Regardless of how powerful and wealthy he might have appeared, in reality, he was just a figurehead. The real power came from the unseen hands of the Jesuits, those mysterious, unknown superiors, who fully utilized that source which was at their disposal. Rome's most awesome, nearly 2,000 years accumulation of wealth, experience, power, and influence, by far, vastly more than any other organization on earth. Being united, Freemasonry, under the ancient and accepted Scottish rites, surged forward to accomplish much for the Catholic cause. Dare I say, universal cause? Expanding from the continent, it was transported to Charleston, South Carolina, where it now rules the rights of the world. True to Jesuit form, to prepare for the evolution of minds, so to carry public opinion in favor of a revolutionary movement, a massive propaganda campaign was launched. And how do you spark revolutions? That magic P word, propaganda. And oh boy, do we see a lot of propaganda today. Which begs the question, who is behind everything going on with these wars and these types of things? And these modern day revolutions, like for example the Ukraine. All of these little uproars, Black Lives Matter, and all of these little things. Who is really sparking the flames? You got the media spitting out the propaganda. From the propaganda, you get these revolutions, or riots, or protests, or whatever. Anyway, moving on. Bear in mind, this was in the middle of the 18th century, so this ain't nothing new under the sun. While in France, philosophers and encyclopedists Diderot, D'Alembert, Helvetius, Grimm, D'Holbach, Voltaire, and Condorcet contributed to the efficiency of spreading revolutionary doctrines for the final cataclysm by effectively using the stage. Publication of their encyclopedia and joining forces with a host of other revolutionary publications circulated all over France. In Germany, close to 800 innocent-looking reading or literary societies were busily being established in every residential center or diocese to incite and mold public thought. The fermentation was astonishing, especially in France, where crowds everywhere stared at papers pasted on walls, breaking into little parties or companies whose conversations turned to politics alone. Don't we see that going on here today, especially during the election year? With every second word, it seemed was morality, philanthropy, toleration, freedom, and equalization of property. Sounds like today, doesn't it? The joint propaganda efforts of French and German Masonic leaders, urged on and guided by their Jesuit architects and superiors, insulted in the notorious French Revolution that was catapulted under the guise of a counterfeit Protestantism. It promised man supreme happiness through his enlightenment and liberation of superstition, but instead ended in a godless reign of terror where heads fell and blood flowed, which is the norm for any Jesuit-inspired project that proudly hails the color red and guillotine as their symbols of revolution. We see a lot of that today with the whole politically correct version of hate, and how everyone seems to be getting offended at everything. In the form of a Mason Lodge, a club met once a week and took the name. A club met once a week. Get this. A club met once a week and took the name Propaganda, quote unquote. It consisted of persons of all nations and was under the direction of the Grand Master of France, the Duke of Orleans. The members, charged with spreading the propaganda of the subversive principles of the club, numbered 50,000. I think today you can probably call them crisis actors. In 1790, it had 20,000 livres at its disposal, but by the end of 1791, these had increased to 30 million. The gold in the printing presses of Frederick the Great were added to those of the Orleanists for the circulation of seditious literature throughout the provinces. This was Propaganda Club number 1. As an interesting sidelight, there is a Masonic propaganda group Number 2. For us today. It is known as the P2 Club, with its headquarters being where? In Rome. It was caught up in a worldwide banking scandal that involved the disappearance of $1.2 billion, resulting in several murders, one man being hung from the London Bridge. The main culprit of the affair was a cardinal and Archbishop Mercinus, who took refuge and asylum at the Vatican to escape prosecution. The P2 Club is a propaganda society of the world's elite, which includes high-ranking Roman Catholic prelates and, of course, Jesuits. The September 13th, 1982 issue of Newsweek magazine, pages 62 through 69, featured a lengthy article of the scandal. The propaganda program that was successful in Germany and overwhelmingly successful in stirring the people of France into a fever-pitched revolution, added one last ingredient as a finishing touch for the molding and supervising of enlightened minds. To be truly enlightened, from the elite's point of view, is to be politically correct or illumined. What better way to ensure that illumination than to found an organization specifically for that purpose? And what better name to identify that purpose than the name the Illuminati? It is common knowledge to anyone who has researched the deceptions of Freemasonry to recognize that there are 3 distinct strata within its system or hierarchy. The first being the so-called Blue Masonry, or their first 3 degrees, which serves as an introduction to Masonry, where none of the real secrets are revealed to the members. The second is the upper degrees, in which most of the members, while imagining themselves to have been initiated into the whole secret of the order, and bursting with importance over their imaginary role of leaders, are taken through steps of degrees which even then are only admitted to a partial knowledge of Masonry's goals. But you're starting to get a little bit. Just not all. Just a little. Just a teaser. The third strata are the true masters, quote-unquote, an inner circle of those who conceal themselves behind high-grade masonry. Admission to this inner circle is not always a matter of degrees. While in practicing visible Freemasonry, the adepts are obliged to pass through all the degrees of the established hierarchy. However, inner and invisible Freemasonry recruit not only among the 33 degrees, and especially in the upper degree groups, but frequently in special cases outside of these. This inner and invisible Freemasonry is international in extent, and it is within this inner circle that the Jesuits conceal themselves, work, and mastermind the projects that suits their goal. The atrocities of the French Revolution bore the true marks of Jesuit promptings. The Jesuit order was dissolved in 1773. That became quite convenient, for how could anyone blame the butchery of the French Revolution on the Jesuits if they were no more? True. However, even though all the Jesuits were supposedly deported out of the European Catholic countries, we are told in the 1908 Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 4, page 37, under the topic Clement, that, quote, 2 non-Catholic sovereigns, Frederick of Prussia and Catherine of Russia, took the Jesuits under their protection. Whatever may have been their motives, whether it was to spite the Pope and Bourbon courts or to please their Catholic subjects and preserve for them the services of the best educators, their intervention kept the order alive until its complete restoration in 1804. In Volume 12, page 525, topic Prussia, it is recorded that Frederick the Great stated, quote, In my kingdom, each may go to heaven after his own fashion, unquote. He provided for the religious and educational needs even of the Catholics and showed favor to the Jesuits. In actual truth, the brief or document that dissolved the Jesuit order provided where possible for Jesuits who had taken their final and absolute vows to remain in their former houses, provided they dressed like secular priests and submitted to the authority of the local bishop. Also, Pope Pius VI, who a little more than a year succeeded Pope Clement XIV, after Clement had dissolved the Jesuits and then died, arranged a peaceful agreement for the Jesuits with Frederick the Great. These quiet undertakings supplied the perfect setting for the Jesuits to pursue their work unhampered and unseen. And we will pick up next time in part 2 of the Architects of the Grand Design with the very, very well-known name amongst conspiracy nuts, such as myself and others, and that is the famous Adam Weishaupt and his Bavarian Illuminati. That's where we will pick up next. And as always, we're going to see that the same order that was behind all the confusion and ruckus to establish a Catholic Freemasonry, although appearing to be anti-Catholic, and also even with popes writing decrees disallowing any Catholic to become Freemasonries or Freemasons. That same group was involved with the Bavarian Illuminati. And we will touch on that in the next presentation. Thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known, stay safe, God bless, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.